All right, if you will find your place in the book of Psalms, chapter 4.
I have a quick question before you get started.
Yeah.
How's Miss Kathy?
Uh, she always has her on and off days. Today was an off
Today
day.
was an off day.
So,
But
yeah,
I meant to ask during prayer time, and
I totally forgot about it too. Wednesday when I with work and preaching chapel and then preaching here, my mind is barely with it as it goes.
pray.
But yes, do pray for Miss Gwen. Of course, she's not feeling good. That's why she's home. I stopped by to pick up the box from her, and Stephanie's going to end up staying the night with her tonight because sometimes nights can be pretty rough. So, um,
So we need to pray for you too,
uh,
because you're gonna have all
yeah.
four of the children too.
not all of them, 3. She'll take the one with her.
Oh, okay.
I got to keep the other 3 because I got to take them to school. All right. Well, oh, that's easy. That's easy. Yeah, we done that long enough. I got that down. All right. Psalm chapter 4. We're gonna read the entire chapter, all 8 verses. But we're gonna read Psalm chapter 4. So, beginning in verse 1. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. O ye sons of men, how long will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing? Selah. But know that the Lord hath set apart him that is godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call unto him. Stand in awe and sin not. Commune with your own heart upon your bed, and be still. Selah. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness, and put your trust in the Lord. There be many that say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. Thou hast put gladness in my heart, more than in the time that their corn and their wine increased. I will both lay me down in peace, and will sleep. For thou, Lord, only makest me to dwell in safety.
Amen.
So this evening, I'm going to be looking at a lesson titled Peace in the Middle of Problems. And I think the best way I can describe this psalm is this is a psalm of David dealing with troubles, but not escaping troubles. Because at this point, David did not escape it. I know we always, of course, when we preach, we love to preach about how, just trust in God and He'll fix all the issues. That wasn't necessarily what was going on here in this psalm. In fact, to take a little bit further back view here, Psalm chapter 4 falls after Psalm chapter 3. Not being funny, but it chronologically or numerically falls in that line. But most people that have looked at this really feel that it actually chronologically falls behind Psalm chapter 3 as well. That Psalm chapter 3 was the first step in David's life. Then he went into Psalm chapter 4. And what's interesting is in Psalm chapter 3, he talks about, the morning time, the awakening. And then in Psalm chapter 4, he talks about the putting me to bed, to be at rest, at peace. So it's like the evening side of it. In Psalm chapter 3, you look at the title there, he says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So when Psalm 3 was written, it was written at the time where David had sinned with Bathsheba, and as a result, that whole thing was coming back to bite him. Basically, he was going to receive the judgment and the fruit of his sin. And as a result, his like Nathan said, that which thou hast done in secret, God's going to put out openly. When he took advantage of a woman that wasn't his, and he committed the sin he did, and then he killed Bathsheba's husband Uriah, he said, "I'm going to make this public." So Absalom, of course, he was one of those people that he won the people's hearts. Now, if you've been in ministry long, there's people that do that love to win the people's hearts. And that's what happened. Absalom won the people's hearts, and he convinced them all that he was the rightful leader at this time, and he had his own father disposed from the kingdom. And he would, of course, as we know, he would set up a bed on the roof of the palace, and he would have sex with every one of David's wives to basically show his power over his own father. Yeah. And in Psalm chapter 3, he writes about this and about having to flee from his own son. And, as he wrote this, he said, "Oh, Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. He said, there was plenty of people that rose up against me. He said, I had more against me than I had for me.
Yeah.
And he said, there was plenty of them that said, there's no hope for that man. He said, God's no longer with David. God's against David, and this is God's new anointed man, Absalom. Now we know that wasn't true. David was going to feel the recompense for his sin, but he was still God's man. But again, the people were rising up, and it seemed everywhere he turned. And I guess to put this into perspective, it sounds easy to say, but put that a little bit of perspective here. David's new enemies were his previous best friends. The people who were his trusted confidants, the people that were his counselors that he went to make wise decisions, they were now his enemy. They were now turned against him.
Yeah.
The guards in his palace that before kept the enemy without were now the ones chasing David, the king, out. The very people who he had put his closest trust, even his own son, his own blood, was now no longer a friend, was no longer trusted. They didn't sit and eat together at the table. He had to run for him in fear of his life. So when David said that it seems as if they've increased, my trouble has increased, he's not just saying I had a bad day. He's not just saying I had a friend that was my best friend and he's not my best friend anymore. David said my whole world has been turned upside down by these events. He said everything has gone wrong. You know, and as he wrote that psalm and he's talking about his fleeing from him, we find here in Psalm chapter 4, he comes and follows this up, and he's talking about, hear me when I call, O Lord. He said, thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me. And we're going to look and dive in a little bit deeper about the parallels to these two different chapters and why most people, and I personally do believe that this was the direct follow-up to Psalm chapter 3. But again, this psalm was written at a time that we know for sure he was at great pressure from his enemies. And as we saw it follows Psalm chapter 3, and you know, he was running from people that were members of his own family, that were confidants, that were friends, that were people he cared about. In fact, you can read when he ran, he had people that were, you know, that he had bestowed great power upon. And I think of Mephibosheth and the servant that was put over Mephibosheth. I cannot remember his name now, but he ended up taking advantage of this time. And when David ended up fleeing, he left Mephibosheth behind to lie and say that, you know, Mephibosheth chose to stay behind and align with the enemy. I mean, he had all kinds of people around him that he couldn't trust anymore. He would, you know, you can imagine. You ever feel like you can't trust anybody? David was definitely a man that understood that. You never knew if the person that you could have trusted yesterday to protect you would be the one that would stab you in the back the next day. So even the people that left with him, he still had to be somewhat suspect. So David was obviously not in a comfortable place. David wasn't in his comfort spot. He wasn't in his nice, you know, barca lounger, you know, I guess, or today, you know, lazy boy. He wasn't getting to enjoy his nice, cool palace. He wasn't enjoying all the frills and the entertainment and all the pleasures of being king. Instead, he was being chased like a rabid animal. And as he writes this, I think one of the things I find the most encouraging as he says this, you don't find David bemoaning as much as you do hear him crying to God and saying, God, help me through this. So as he's writing this, you know, it makes, to me, when I was thinking this, it makes me think of a war movie. Anybody in here like war movies? I enjoy watching war movies. You're watching a war movie, and you get to this critical spot in the battle, and it seems as if there's bullets flying from every direction, bombs are flying. At any moment you're convinced that your life could be over. And there's always that one soldier in the group that's a seasoned veteran. He's been here before, he's done this. And he is for some unknown, unshakable reason, is not nervous, he's not scared, and he's the one saying, boys, cheer up. Get up. Yeah. Stop ducking. Get up. We got to fight. There's a fight in front of us. You can't hide in the hole. You got to get up and go. You know, there was a movie, I will say you have to watch it with a swear blocker, which most movies you do. But, you know, We Were Soldiers. I remember thinking of that point when they were in that landing zone. This was a true story. Yes. You know, there was enemies literally surrounding them in this landing zone. And you see this one guy who plays the master sergeant, and he's standing there with a pistol in his hand. He's looking down at the guys huddling on the ground. He said, you can't get any of them from the ground, get up.
Yeah.
And there's bullets just flying everywhere, and you just see this man standing here. Why? Because he was a seasoned soldier. He'd been here, he'd seen this before, and even though it was at the worst it could possibly be, he trusted in his men, and he knew what he was capable of.
Yeah.
For David, when he was in this situation, David was in a tight spot, but this wasn't David's first rodeo either. Take you back in your mind just a little ways ago. Go back to David before he was the king. He was anointed as a son of Jesse to become the king. Saul was still in leadership at the time, and Saul and him were just besties. They were like, no, not really. Saul didn't care for David one bit.
Amen.
In fact, the more he hung around David, the more he hated David. You imagine as they came back from war and the women are sitting there screaming out, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens thousands. And he's sitting there going, you mean you're telling me this man's going to take my throne and he's taking the people from me? And then we find out, as we know, that Saul's own son, Jonathan, became best friends with David. And even that angered him even more. He sat there, and we talked about this morning in chapel about that, the fact that Jonathan had to actually make up an excuse for why David ran out of the kingdom, because he knew what was coming. And when his father found out that he was hiding David, that he let him sneak out, he was so mad he threw a javelin at his own son, trying to kill his own son. So David spent all that time running and staying and hiding and always trying to stay one step ahead of Saul and his army. So David was no newbie to the idea of running from an army coming for him. This was kind of old hat, I guess is the way to put it. And it's not that he was looking forward to it, but he'd been here. And he knew God could get him through it because he'd been there. And I think that's the same thing some of the times we tend to forget is we've been here before. There's nothing new under the sun. And if we haven't been here, we can read about someone else who has been there. We can use God's word to show us where someone has been there and they were able to make it through it. So as David's talking again, we know that this was not a new thing to him. And there's many times in our lives, while we may not be being chased down by a foreign power, there's things in your life where you feel like you've been in a tight spot where it feels as if you can't look up, you can't look down. It feels like you're drowning in what's going on. It may be a financial, problems. I know with money is one of those things when you don't have a lot of it, you think you wouldn't worry about it much, but the less you have, it seems the more you worry about it. I've been there. I've been there where every single time there's when you even talk about having to go somewhere, you go, man, I don't even have the gas money to go. Why are we even talking about this? Yeah. So it may be that it's financial issues. It may be family or friends or coworkers or whoever the case may be that has you constantly on the defense. I'll tell you, without getting into detail, we had a meeting not that long ago at my work, and I felt like everyone was against me in the meeting. So you kind of feel like you just want to get up and run. David said, trust me, been there, got the t-shirt, I've got the bumper sticker, I've got the hat, I've got the poster, and it was signed. And he said, I've been there, I've got that. But what is David going to do here in Psalm chapter 4? David's not going to bemoan. David's not going to cry. David's not going to talk about why, God, did you let this happen to me? No, he's going to instead encourage us to have peace in spite of those problems. And we're going to look at that here. We have to understand, how can a person gain victory without the victory being won yet? You ever think of that? As a Christian, we're called to have victory before victory's been called. You imagine a soldier running around saying, boy, we won. Well, the fight's not over yet. Oh, no, we got this. It's done. But the fighting's not over yet. Yes, but we're going to win. That's a Christian. A Christian can walk around in the battle and say, we've won. And I say, won what? The battle's still going. Oh, no, it's going to be over. We've won. And David, as he wrote this, he could have this kind of peace. Because the truth was, he wasn't just a casual believer in God. He didn't simply just say, oh, that sounds good. He lived it, he breathed it, and he sought God when his troubles came. And that's what we're going to see here. We're going to see, first of all, how can we have peace despite the problems? We can have peace because we have to choose to pray instead of panic in verse 1. We have to choose to pray instead of panic. He said, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. So as David is writing this, he immediately starts off with going to God in communion. David comes to God with a boldness because he knows that when he prays, God's going to listen. And this wasn't because he knew God had to listen here. It's because he had experienced God hearing his prayers before. So when the trouble came, he knew immediately where to go because he was ready. You know, we teach the kids fire drills. We teach them fire drills not because it's fun, not because it's enjoyable, but because when trouble comes, we want them to instinctively know what to do. We don't want it to even be a thought. And the truth is, if you're constantly relying on God, even when times are good, then when bad times come, you instinctively know what to do. There's not a what do I do now? Yeah. And for David, he didn't do what do I do now? Why? Because he'd been constantly being in that place with God. So when trouble came, it wasn't what do I do now? It's go back to the same place I've always gone, which is go to God with it. So he prayed instead of panic. He went to God in communion. You know, in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 6, it says, "Let us therefore come boldly under the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in a time of need." That was Hebrews 4:16. He said, come boldly before him that you could find mercy. What do you find find David praying for? He said, have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. So the very thing David was praying for is the thing later Hebrews would follow up and say, do the same thing. Have boldness, go before God, and he will give you mercy. So as David's praying, he's coming before him with boldness, asking for his mercy. David, you notice one thing too, he goes to God before he goes to man. You realize David was a man that knew a lot of people. He had connections. David could have easily just said, okay guys, this rebellion's too much. I'm good friends with King such and such. I'm really good friends with the gentleman over here, and he has a pretty sizable army. I'm going to go get with all of my buddies and confer with him, and we're going to come back and attack. He didn't go confer with man on what he should do to respond to the problem. What does he do? He goes to God instead. Amen. You know, we see as Charles Spurgeon wrote on this, he said, observe that David speaks first to God, then to men. Surely we should speak all the more boldly to men if we had more constant converse with God. He who dares to face his maker will not tremble before the sons of men. David sat there and he said basically, look, I had to stand before God in fear when I'd sinned, and I made it right. I don't have to fear before men. Yeah. You know, he ran, but he wasn't running out of fear. But he ran, and he, like I said, he wasn't fearful before Absalom. David, again, as we saw, he went to God in communion. He went to God with boldness. He came to God before he went to men. He recognized the power of God. He said, in verse 1 again, he said, he called him the God of my righteousness. When you look at the word God of my righteousness, it literally means you are the author, the witness, the maintainer, the judge, and the rewarder of my righteousness. Amen. In other words, David was saying, while others mocked me, as we saw in Psalm chapter 3, he said, how are they increased? Verse 2, there be they which say of my soul, there is no help of God in him. He said, they tell me there's no hope of God in me. He said, but you're the author and writer of my righteousness. While they call me a castaway of God, he said, I don't count for them. I count what you say of me, and you call me righteous. You counted me for righteous. So he said, God, you're the author of my faith. You know, and it wasn't by any good deeds of his own, but instead it was by his seeking the forgiveness of God and relying upon his mercy that he could say, you are the God of my righteousness. So we look at, first of all, as he comes to him, how could he have peace despite the problems? He first of all chose to pray instead of panic. Yeah. Second of all, he chose, I skipped one section there. I apologize. I usually have paper notes, but my printer died. I got a new printer and it won't work with the computer, so that's a mess. In any case, I'm getting used to this. So he recognized the power of God. So we saw that first of all, he chose to pray instead of panic because he came to God in communion, but he chose to pray instead of panic because he went to God for comfort. He said in the second part of verse 1, he said, thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. David was writing at this time during a time of war because he was at battle. He said, thou hast enlarged me when I was distressed. The word enlarge means to make wide, to make it ease, essentially. The word distress means a narrower, tight place. He said, God, by world standards, I was in a very tight spot. I was in a tight space. He said, I was constricted. They were on all sides. They were come after me. He said, but God, when I come to you, he said, you enlarge me. He said, I look everything around me. Anybody ever get this way where you start really getting so focused on what's around you, you really feel like the walls are closing in? I mean, I've had times where it literally felt like I was struggling to breathe because I was letting everything come down on me so hard. David said, I was in that spot. I was being pressed about on every side. I was in a narrow place. He said, but God, when I went to you, he said, you widened me. You opened it up. And it wasn't that the situation changed. The difference was who he was relying upon to get him through changed. So we see that he was given comfort. You know, he said that he came to God with his call. You know, he called for mercy from God, as we saw there. When situations tend to careen out of control, we often scramble to find our answers. We scramble to find, fix A, fix B, fix C. You don't actually find David at all sitting there trying to find fixes for the problem. Instead, he goes to God for peace. He goes to God for mercy. He goes to God and says, enlarge me. This situation has got me pressed. He said, but enlarge me. So, as we look at here, we're going to see that, again, how you have peace, you have to choose to go to God first. So David was able to have peace despite the problems because he prayed instead of panicked. Secondly, in verses 2 through 5, he had peace instead of panic because he chose to have confidence instead of cowardice. Confidence instead of cowardice in verses 2 through 5. Keep in mind, David was not merely facing a bunch of name-calling people. He wasn't facing a bunch of no-name, unimportant people that all they could say was mean words and hurt his feelings and say how David is a meanie. David's a mean, terrible person. He's ungodly and wicked. David was facing more than just names. He wasn't facing mean words. He wasn't facing discouraging looks. David was facing people who had the very ability to cause great harm, if not take his very life. They were much larger in numbers than his own, and therefore it would have been easy to cower in fear. Again, we said in chapter 3, verse 1, how are they increased that trouble me! Exclamation point. David said, they're everywhere. They're just, it's like every time I turn around, the person who I used to thought was my compadre is now my enemy. He said they're increasing. Absalom's power is growing. But instead of running in fear, he instead depended on God and got confidence. Charles Spurgeon again said this. He said, he allows that his enemies are great men, for such is the import of the Hebrew word translated sons of men. But still he believes them to be foolish men, and therefore chides them as though they were just children. David basically said, look, yeah, you seem to have the power, but you don't have the power of God.
Amen.
His character was attacked, though. We see that in verses 2 through 3, they said, O ye sons of men, how long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing? When he said that they will turn their glory into shame, their tactics we see when they attacked him was they lied about David's honor. They lied about his character. In fact, the word leasing is basically against the idea of falsehood, of lies. He said, how long will you go to lies? How long would you rather talk things that aren't true and make lies about me than do the truth? You ever feel like you just sit there and want to tell a person, man, you sure do love lies, because I've tried to give you truth all day long, but you just won't hear it. You know, you get to a point where you just go, unless it's a lie, I'm just pretty convinced you're not going to believe it. You know, so I just want to make something up against you. In fact, I mean, not to reference too much, but in one of the meetings we were having, they were making discussions about business practices, and I finally just said to him, said, look, if you think that something's going on fishy, and you've got no evidence behind it, then I'm calling the cops, and every one of you are all fixing to get arrested, because every one of you is a thief. And they all look at me like I'm crazy. I said, well, if you can accuse without evidence, I can accuse without evidence. What's the difference? Lies are lies. And that's exactly where David was. David said, look, every one of you has falsely accused me. David admitted his sin and made right, but they were still, of course, falsely accusing him, just like people love to do. Their tactics that they would lie about his glory or about his honor, that they would dishonor his name. But David, instead of remembering and focusing on that, he chose to put his trust instead somewhere else. He said, verse 3, but know that the Lord has set apart him that is godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call unto him.
Amen.
He said, yeah, y'all can sit there and talk up and say that I'm not a man of God. You can sit there and say that I'm not worthy of my position. He said, but God has set apart those that are for his. And he said, he didn't set apart Absalom, he set apart me. He said, you can call me ungodly, but God calls me righteous. He said, you can say that I'm not worthy, but he said, the Lord will hear when I call unto him. They're having fun in there apparently.
We got swords.
Oh, do
Sword
they?
of the Spirit.
Oh, okay. But so David again, he chose to set his trust in God. He had seen God protect him before, as he said when he said, but know that the Lord has set him apart. When he said, but know, that is, they know by experience word. He said, but know, I've been here before, and I was the one set apart by God. He understood he had the ear of God. You know, it's in Psalm 66:18, it says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. David said, I know I had iniquity, and Nathan came before me, wagged that finger, and I made it right. I came to that threshing floor when the angel of God was sitting there killing people left and right, and I made it right at that point. He said, I know that I've sinned, but I've made it right. And he said, because of that, I know I have the ear of God. David understood that while his enemies and the crowds were willing to believe a lie, the lie that Absalom was supposed to be the true leader, he said God knew the truth. You know, I think in churches, when we've had one here in town, people that choose to rise up against God's leadership in a church. I can imagine that, you know, that pastor here in town would really be able to relate to David and say, you can rise up against, he said, but I know who God set apart. And he said, I know that God will hear my prayer. So David, as he went through this, how did he have peace despite the problems? It's because he chose to pray instead of panic. It's because David chose to have confidence instead of cowardice. And then we're going to see that he had confidence instead of cowardice, because his character was attacked and his character was revealed through that attack. In verses 4 through 5, we're going to see that his character was revealed. He said in verse 4, stand in awe and sin not. Commune with your own heart upon your bed, and be still, Selah. Offer sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. So we see his character was revealed, because instead of all these people casting all these terrible things against him, saying all these lies, attacking him, taking his leadership position, instead of him sitting there just simply praying, God, kill them all, he said, pray to God that you get right. Man, that's a hard thing to do. When your enemies are coming at you, you just want to pray for God's fire and brimstone to fall down on them. Yeah. David said, no, pray. He said, get your heart right. Go to your own private bed and get your heart right. I think David at this point said, look, I've been wrong, and I've sinned, and I've done wrong. I know where you're at. Get it right. You've got to get it right. David, we see his character revealed in the fact that, again, he didn't immediately go towards, calling for all of their deaths. I can tell you from my own experience, when I had my car stolen at gunpoint, after I got back, I remember telling my wife, I said, I've been praying the whole way back that one of those tires pops and that thing rolls down the highway at 110 and ejects both of them. And she sat there saying, Dan, you can't say that. I said, I can too. I said, David prayed for his enemies to be smoked. I said, I just want them smoked. I said, I'm just hoping one of those tires had a bubble on the sidewall and it just pops and they just roll it. And I was quite mad because I liked that car quite a bit. They liked it more than me, though. But in any case, David didn't say that. David instead, as he wrote here, he said, stand in awe and sin not. He said, recognize God's leadership in this. Don't sin in this anymore. He said, commune with your own heart upon your bed and be still. Offer sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. So he's writing to these very people that had cast him out, and he's telling them to get their heart right. That really tells you again the heart of David, that his character was revealed. David told them to reverence God by fearing him, by standing in awe, to avoid their sin, to contemplate their actions, as he told them to commune with your own heart, and to put their confidence in the Lord. David had an unshakable faith because he trusted God in the past, and he could trust God now. The very same God who gave him victories over the bear and the lion is the very same one he believed could give him victory over this situation. I know I've given reference to this before, but I've dealt with anxiety in the past, and it's still there. It's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still there from time to time. I remember times where I was working at a job I absolutely hated, and there is no better way to put it. I hated my job. I purposely stepped into work late every day. I hid whenever I could. I knew all the hiding spots in the dealership. I really despised my job, and I did not like who I worked for. And it caused me a lot of anxiety. And there was times where I literally just had to go and find a hiding spot, turn off the light in a closet. I mean, I'm not joking. I would sit on the floor, turn off the light, shut the door, and I would sit there in a closet in the darkness, and I would sit there and recite the Word of God and remember the same God. And I would sit there and tell myself the same God that could bring Paul through getting stoned, that could take
Amen.
Paul to where he could go to the cross and say,
Amen.
you know, forgive these people. That same God is my God too.
Amen.
That's where David was.
Amen.
David was remembering all of the triumphs
Yeah.
that God had given him and saying, I know this situation's terrible, but he got me through that. He can get me through this. So his character was revealed. Thirdly, we're going to see lastly that he chose to seek God instead of seeking goods. And verses 6 through 8, he's going to pick this up. There be many that say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. Thou hast put gladness in my heart more than the time that their corn and their wine increased. Now, this is something I hadn't thought of before. I was listening to another preacher, so I can't claim it as my idea. He said, if you really put this into the confidence of his, into the situation of his running from Absalom, he writes this. He said, thou hast put gladness in my heart more than the time that their corn and wine increased. He said, it may have been that when David had to run, he had to run during the time of harvest. And as he's running during the time of harvest, guess what he doesn't have ready for him 3 times a day? A hot and ready meal.
Yep.
He didn't have that waiting for him. And they didn't have, they didn't have hot pockets with microwaves on the go. They didn't have MREs to eat on the trip. They were scrounging to get food every meal. I mean, they were lucky to get probably 1 to 2 meals at best a day, and they were meager at best. And you imagine this crowd that had left with David, that had run away with him, they're all sitting there almost kind of like the children of Israel saying, David, look, I know you're the man of God, but if you really are, I don't get this. I look back there, and all those that you say were not doing the right thing, man, they got plenty of food, plenty of drink. They're living life pretty good. David, we're struggling to just get our next meal.
Yeah.
And you can imagine David sitting there talking to these people, just like, the children of Israel complaining about the fact that all they had was just bare minimum. God, you brought us out into the desert to starve, but yet they were right where God wanted them. Just like even though they were struggling just to make ends meet, David said, look, I understand that they have all the harvest. They have all of the wine a heart could desire. He said, but I have gladness in my heart more than their stuff. He said, I'd rather have you than have all that stuff. So as David was talking to these people, you can imagine he wasn't just saying this to himself, he was saying it to the men that had followed him, saying, guys, I know we're struggling. I know you're passing by all these fields white unto harvest and people harvesting them, knowing that everyone back at the palace is eating like kings, and yet we're eating like paupers. He said, but guess what? He said, I'd rather have the God's gladness in my heart than have all that food and have all that drink I could possibly have. And the truth is, I think we all live there to a certain extent. Anybody ever sit there and drive by those billboards for the mega bucks or whatever it is, and you sit there and think, Lord, I will be fair with that money. I would tithe off of it. I would give you missions. I said missionaries all over the world would be just getting random checks for $50,000 from me and go, woo, where'd this come from? And it just be assigned to that person. Lord, just give me the numbers. Give me wet noodles. I'm gonna throw them against the wall and just make the numbers randomly show in there or something. I'm living godly and I have so little. David, and it wasn't that the thought escaped him. He understood it. It wasn't like he was trying to preach to the paupers while he was enjoying the princely riches. He wasn't. He said, I would rather have gladness in my heart than to have all that stuff. So for him, and how did he have peace instead of the problems? Because peace in spite of the problems is because he chose to seek God instead of seeking goods. He said that he placed value on the eternal and not the impermanent, the goods of this world. Again, those things, the stuff. He chose to seek after righteousness instead. David asked for the light of God to shine on him. He said, verse 6, there be many that say, who will show us any good? He said, there are plenty of them sitting there saying, David, we followed you, but this doesn't seem to be a good idea. Stay behind. He said, Lord, lift up the light of thy countenance upon us. He said, just shine on us. He said, I'm not asking for a bunch of stuff. Just reveal your glory to us. You know, I think most of us would admit there's been times where we were really low in a bad spot. And some of the times it was something as simple as God just making something small happen. And when you saw the light of God just a little bit, it all of a sudden made the whole situation easier to bear. You know, I'll tell you, going to the school, preaching at chapel is not always my most favorite thing. Because I'm rushing on Wednesday. It's a very hectic day to try to get everything done at work and then be there. And then a lot of times you have kids that aren't really listening. They're sleeping, they're laughing, they're joking, they're doing everything but paying attention. And all you just want to say is, you bunch of ingrates. Do you know what it takes for me to study, to be ready, and be here? Do you know the sacrifice I have to make at work to make sure I'm here for this time? And you get frustrated with it. And you get annoyed. But then some of the times God gives you just that little bit of a light. I mean, I was so excited to be able to lead Derek to the Lord. I mean that really made my year. It really has. It was just so exciting to see a fruit of it. David said, just give me a little.
Yeah, it's a little.
He said, just give me a little bit.
Yeah,
He said, just shine a little bit on my face.
Amen.
He said, so I can show it to those that are around me, and so we can get through this situation. You know, David, again, he asked for his God's to shine his face on him. You know, Charles Spurgeon wrote this. He said, he drinks not from the muddy pools of mammon, but from the fountain of life above. The light of God's countenance is enough for him. This is his riches, his honor, his health, his ambition, his ease. Give him this, and he will ask no more. That was David. He didn't even say, restore me my kingdom.
Yeah.
Did you notice that? That'd been my first prayer.
Yeah.
God, get me back in the big house. Come on now. You know I'm supposed to be there. You anointed me. He didn't ask for that. He said, just shine on my face. He said, put gladness in my heart.
Yeah.
That's the toughest part, I think, of anything. He didn't pray for being removed from troubles. He just prayed for relief in the trouble.
Yeah.
So as he wrote again, he said, he asked again for God to shine his light on him. David knew that possessions come and they go, but only the relationship with God is eternal. He understood fully what Proverbs 23:5 said, when it said, wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings, and they fly away as an eagle toward heaven. And that they do. I mean, not being funny, we can all say, if you added up all the money you made over the last few years, you go, wow, that's a lot of money. And you look and go, wow, where did it all go? And it's just gone. And I mean, obviously, you could look at your kids and go, you ate every one of those dollars.
Right.
It wasn't just them, but they ate their healthy dose of it. But, you know, David understood possessions were temporary, but the relationship with God was eternal. He received satisfaction and not emptiness. He said in verse 7 again, he put gladness in my heart. The unrighteous, they rely on temporary things to bring them pleasure, don't they? It's these things of this world that make them happy. That's why you'll find people who are always living above their means. Why? Because what they have is their happiness. I mean, I remember listening to videos of people that were teaching sales techniques and, you know, talk about the car you drive really sets the impression of who you are.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't.
That's right.
You could show up in a Mercedes-Benz and be broke. Trust me, I know. I've seen people's credit. I've seen enough of their credit to look at it and go, you don't eat much, do you? Because I see you spend all your money on that. You know, you have a person come in and you go, and even one of the gentlemen that worked with me, he used to deal in businesses where he went to people's houses and had to do stuff. And he said, I've been to plenty of those big 3,000 square foot houses, you know, and Brother Wade's even mentioned this, going to big 3,000 square foot houses with 2 Mercedes sitting in the driveway and you step inside and they got patio furniture in the house because it's all about an image.
Yeah.
For David, for him, he didn't rely on temporary things to please him. It may have been that David, again, as we talked about, fled during that time of harvest, and he was looking back at them and saying, boy, it'd be good to have all the bounty of that harvest. But ultimately, it's temporary. Matthew 6:19 would again tell us not to lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt, where thieves do break in and steal. David said, look, if all that goes away, but I've still got you, I'm still on top. So we see that he received satisfaction and not emptiness, because the unrighteous rely on temporary things, but instead, David chose to rely on God for his satisfaction. When we seek after God for our fulfillment, we don't live a life with regrets. When you look for the world for all of your pleasure, the truth is you're going to lose it all at one point. And when all that goes away, there goes your pleasure right along with it. There's been plenty of people who, they've reached the top, and when they lose everything, as far as they're concerned, life is no longer worth living, because those things is what gave them value. I was on my way to that. I'll be honest. I was very much a car person, and I was always about getting the nicest and the newest and the best, and getting this and that. I'm obviously over that, because I'm driving a truck that was built the day that I graduated from high school, which was a while ago now. It's not that important to me anymore. I'll be honest. I look at new trucks and I go, man, that's pretty expensive, and I go, I'm over it. But things have, obviously perspective has changed, and that's ultimately what David was looking at. He saw his perspective was changing. Solomon learned this, sadly, many years later into the end of his life, when it was almost too late for that lesson to be learned. But he wrote in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 1, verse 2 and verse 14, he said, vanity of vanities. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I have seen the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. I was watching a video online. I like following this series where it's a bunch of car talks. Not surprising, but it's really interesting. But they talked about this one guy who was a financier, and he was helping a guy finance a collection of cars. And this guy wanted to look impressive, but he didn't have all the money he needed. So one by one, he started financing these cars. And by the time he was done, he had 15 luxury cars, just so he could look impressive, but he didn't own one of them. Every one of them he was just barely making payments on. He had a big fancy house. He had a Learjet. He had a big boat, and every one of these was financed within the dime. And of course, come to find out, the way he was getting by with it was by doing illegal things. And even then, it was just barely enough to pay for all of this stuff. He ended up getting caught, and of course, he ended up going to jail for a certain period of time. And then one of the people he did extremely wrong decided he no longer needed to live, and he was found dead within his with one of his apartments. But the whole idea, of course, was talking about the car aspect, but I got more out of it than that. I was sitting there thinking, again, this is a man who lived for stuff. And if it meant I had to steal to get it, I'm going to get it. And then when stuff went away, his life ended as a result. For David, he wasn't living about stuff. He didn't find his satisfaction in things, because he was able to have peace despite the problems. And we're going to find that perfectly illustrated in verse 8. He said, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me to dwell in safety. David understood, again, in the Bible, it talks about, some men trust in chariots, but I will trust in the name of my Lord. The Bible says that, the righteous runneth, that the name of the Lord is a strong tower, the righteous runneth into it and is safe. It wasn't that David at this exact moment was safe. It wasn't that he wrote, oh, well, because I prayed, God made all my enemies just poof, and they're all gone. I'm good now. No, he said, but you've put me at peace.
Yeah.
How many people here have spent late nights up just worrying yourself to death? David said, I was there, but when I went to God, he gave me peace, and I was able to rest. Even though I was in a world of turmoil, he said, I could be that guy that slept through the hurricane. I used to have I'd say I used to have a sister. I still do have a sister, but I used to live with my sister, and she was that kind of a sleeper. We had tornadoes go through our backyard. I mean, literally tear up trees. They landed on the back porch. They landed in the pool. They tore down the fence. They landed on the power lines, blew the power. And guess what? She was sleeping through the whole thing. Unbelievable. That's a person that has peace despite the problems. Maybe too much peace, but she had peace. She was sleeping like a rock. David said, even though the storm raged around me, you gave me peace and I could rest. So if we want to know what it means, what it takes to have rest, David said, go to God with your troubles. Lay him at his feet. Don't live for the things. Instead, live for God, and you can have peace. David would be the same one that would say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Of course, Psalm 23, most of us know that. But David was at ease. Why? Because he was in the fortress of God's protection. Proverbs 18:10 said, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it and is safe." David slept in the midst of 1,000 enemies. Why? Because he was at peace. Because he trusted God. Now, I understand the fact that just because you trust God doesn't mean bad things don't happen.
Right.
But the fact is, he trusted God that whatever happened, it would be his will. He trusted God enough to say, look, this may not be my will. I promise you it wasn't David's will to be a vagabond from his own kingdom. But he said, God, if this is your will, I'll have peace in it. And ultimately, I think that's the hardest part to learn, I think, of being a Christian, is the fact that being a Christian doesn't mean everything gets fixed.
Everything's not hunky-dory.
Everything doesn't get fixed. You know, I'll tell you my own example. When Brother Gary died, I know he wasn't a direct relative of mine. He was a very good friend, obviously. But when he died, that moment in my life became more clear than ever that just because you're a Christian doesn't mean things are always going to go the way you think it should go. And when you pray about it, it doesn't mean it's going to get answered. When I heard that at that moment he wasn't breathing and they were rushing him to the hospital, I was praying the whole way as I left work running to the hospital, thinking God is going to raise him up. He's not going to die. He's got young girls that depend on him. He's got a wife that depends on him. He's got a business. God's not going to take him. He's 40-something years old. When I got there and found out he hadn't made it, I'm telling you, it crushed me like nothing's ever crushed me before. Because it's that moment that I realized that just because I prayed doesn't mean it's going to go the way I think it was supposed to go. And just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that everything always goes the way you think it should go. And it was a hard lesson, and I think it's one that it took me a while to really grasp it. And I'll be honest, I don't always have a perfect understanding of it, but I think most of us would say if you've been a Christian long enough, you've got to realize to have peace, it doesn't mean that everything goes away, because it doesn't. But having peace means that even though you're surrounded by enemies, he said, I can lay down in peace. I can sleep, for thou, O Lord, makest me to dwell in safety. So David could have peace in spite of the problems because he chose to pray instead of panic, because he chose to have confidence in God instead of cowardice before men, and because he chose to seek God instead of the world's goods to seek satisfaction. There's plenty of people who, that's what they seek to. You ever heard of people that I'm trying to remember how they word it, shopping therapy? Oh, everything's falling down around them, so they take old Lucky Visa and they go spend money because that makes them feel better. It doesn't fix anything, big surprise. But David said, don't seek those things, but seek instead of the Lord. And I know it is time for us to finish. I think I'm on pastor time, though. He ends about this time, so we're good. So let's go ahead and let's pray. Lord, I do thank you this evening, Lord, for, again, this time we've had to be in your word. Lord, I thank you for the fact that, Lord, our faith is not merely just talk. Lord, it's not merely just a crutch. It's not just something good to say to make you feel better when times are bad. Lord, but our faith is real. That our faith has a resting place, Lord, and it's in your name. And Lord, David understood that. Lord, David knew that despite the storm that raged about him, he could be at peace because he chose to pray to you and come to you. And Lord, even at this point, he didn't fix everything, just like he doesn't always fix our problems right away or even at all. Lord, but some of the times it just takes us coming to peace with God over our situation. And I pray that each and every one of us would learn to do that, Lord. It's a lifelong lesson. And Lord, help us to have that same peace, because when the storm rages and we're at peace, Lord, there's no better picture of what being a Christian means to the unsaved world, when a Christian can be at peace in the storm. Lord, I pray that you'd help each and every one of us to learn to allow ourselves to be widened, Lord, when the world is narrowing our path and feels like it's surrounding us. Lord, help us to have that same kind of peace in spite of the problems. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, well, Miss, I got no piano here, so I'll get the music started. And apparently this thing decided not to work, so that's lovely. Oh well. I guess it was only meant for y'all.